This week I'm joined by Tom Cheetham, who is an author, teacher, scientist, and poet exploring creative imagination and the imaginal in human life and culture. In this first episode of 2 on the work of Henry Corbin, we discuss the work of Corbin, Ivan Illich, and Cheetham's text, The World Turned Inside Out. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you would like to support Hermitix and gain access to some exclusive content and keep the podcast going indefinitely, then please find links for the Patreon in the description below. If you'd like to join the community, please also find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. Okay, so Tom Cheetham, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
You bet. I'm glad to be here.
We're going to be discussing the work of Henry Corbin. You've written many books about Corbin, so I began with your text, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin and the Angel Out Ahead. But I guess before we jump into his work, just tell us a little bit about yourself and where you began with Corbin.
Yeah, so I can date it within a couple of years because in 1990, I discovered James Hillman, the sort of renegade Jungian and founder of what he called archetypal psychology. And I came across Hillman's work entirely by chance. At the time, I was being a theoretical biologist, or at least pretending to be. And I ran across a copy of Thomas More's survey of Hillman's work of Blue Fire in a bookstore in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it completely floored me. I won't go into my background, but it's all over the map: philosophy and science and all sorts of other things. And when I saw Hillman, I just utterly, this is relevant to the Corbin thing, because when I looked into that book about and by Hillman, I just thought to myself, this is what I've been looking for all my life. And what about Hillman, what primarily, although everything enchanted me, was the fact that he took imagination not just seriously, but as the central feature of reality. and Hillman's style is heretical and wild and crazy, and yet scholarly and brilliant at the same time. So I just fell in love with Hillman. And I read Hillman's stuff for probably at least 2 years until I ran across his Eranos essay, The Thought of the Heart. And in the first chapter of that, I can almost quote it these days, but he says, any of you who had ever had an opportunity to hear Henry Corbin lecture have been present at a manifestation of the thought of the heart. And he went on. And I thought, I've never heard of this guy. Who the heck is Henry Corbin? And because Hillman, he was just idolizing it, and I thought, okay, I got to find out. And this was 92 or something, back in the day when you still had to order books through the mail, all that old stuff. I got a copy of Corbin's Creative Imagination and the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, and I could talk about my response forever, but what I'll say to begin with is I was both utterly enchanted and repelled, because I had been raised in a not religious household, and I was a good liberal who thought that the religions of what Corbin calls the religions of the book, the great monotheisms, were nothing but patriarchal and authoritarian, and just, it was just nothing I wanted to have anything to do with. And yet, here's Corbin talking about the Bible and the Quran, and I discover that he's an Islamic, scholar of Islamic mysticism, and oh man, I can't do this. Then, as you were talking before we started recording, as I started doing a little research, I discovered that he was the first French translator of Heidegger. And I was an undergraduate philosophy major and underwent 2 failed attempts to go to graduate school in philosophy. And I, at the time, held Heidegger in great regard. And I thought, well, wait a minute. Okay, so Hillman loves him. He was the first translator of Heidegger. I can maybe put up with this other stuff. And so I'd read a few pages, and I find that book to be utterly entrancing and completely beautiful. And then he'd start talking about angels. And it was, oh, man, what? How am I good? And I mean, in one sense, I easily spent 20 years trying to make his world real to myself and to see it as he saw it, which, the question I asked myself is, where is this guy that he can see these things and say these things? And the more I learned about him, the more it began to make sense that he was himself something of a mystic, though he makes no claims to that. It's quite clear that he was. And he was a scholar of the Western theological and philosophical tradition at a very high level. And then he just fell in love with Islamic mysticism when he was a student at the Sorbonne. And so he's got Husserl and he's got Heidegger and he's got all the Catholic and Protestant theological tradition at his fingertips. I can talk about Corbin forever. Mm-hmm. He was also a linguist. I think, gosh, just recently, one of my young colleagues, Hadi Fakouri, informed me that in addition to all the other languages that he was familiar with, Hadi found out that he was good in, 3 or 4 others that I didn't know about. He was proficient in about a dozen languages, both ancient and modern, mm-hmm. including, Arabic and Persian and Sanskrit and all the European languages.
The tough ones.
Yeah. And I'm a sucker for that. If you're a master of languages, which I totally am not, then my estimation of you goes very high. And while doing that sort of biographical research, I was reading his books and finding the way into it. Which can be kind of daunting because he's not always very easy to read. And I mean, just to summarize, I don't really know what it was that kept me stuck, or that's not at all the right word, but something just kept me attached to him. I couldn't stop. For a number of years, there was something so amazing.
That's when you've found almost like the one of philosophy, right? When they have a elusive orbit, and you just every time you go to read someone else, you read someone else, and then eventually you go, "Hang on, I ended up back here again. I'm here again." Right?
Yeah. I couldn't put it down. At the same time, I mean, and so. Because of the way I came to Corbin, which was via Hillman, mm-hmm. and of course Jung, because Hillman is a Jungian, and I started with Hillman and realized that, I guess I better learn more about Jung. And so as part of that process, I read quite a lot of Jung. But that's how I came to Corbin. Mm-hmm. And my reading of Corbin has always been inflected by my enthusiasm for Hillman, which makes my reading of Corbin it's well to for students of my work to keep that in mind, because, well, we can talk about that, but
so I'm gonna assume if I asked you the Hermitix question, three thinkers in a room, living or dead, and you can listen in on the conversation. Corbin is already in there, and you add three more. I'm going to assume that Hillman would be one.
Okay, so the question is, what three thinkers in a room? I am unprepared to answer that question, but I will. So Corbin is definitely one, except
Corbin's already there. Let's say Corbin's already there.
He's there.
Three more, yeah.
But actually that's very difficult, because I wouldn't talk to him. I would just sit and listen, So it would have to be three people talking while I'm listening and just shutting up, And I'm actually not sure it would be Hillman. Ivan Illich would be one. Those are two. We could talk about this. Those are two that I really would love to hear talk. And who would be the third? I can't even imagine. Just the two of them, and Corbin and Illich, and not Hillman, because I'm quite set in my ways. I have, one of the things about doing what I've done, having never met Hillman in the flesh, though we had kind of a telephone friendship. I never met Corbin, of course. Never met Hillman. I never met Ivan Illich, who's another major figure for me, though I could have. I'm very happy that I didn't meet any of them, because now I don't know what they were really like in person. I have my version of them, which is what I think, at least as you get older, that's what you need. You need the version of them which is appropriate for you. And I think Corbin would be happy with that. Hillman in particular was a very difficult guy. I'm not sure I want to know that part of him, We're off on some sort of tangent here. But Illich and Corbin for sure.
So as I'd understand it, I mean, with what I've read of Illich, I mean, I've primarily focused obviously on his sort of technological tools of conviviality and deschooling stuff. But I don't know, perhaps I'm wrong in this because I haven't read completely into Illich. Yeah, but there is an undercurrent of a very practical spirituality or mysticism within it. Obviously, he's a Catholic priest, but there's a mysticism in there specifically that I sort of felt a revival of mysticism from these practical methodologies regarding conviviality and deschooling. So do you think that the conversation would surround that sort of rebirth of a practical mysticism?
That's a really good way to put it. So I forget which book or books it's in, but I spent some time reading Illich and Corbin simultaneously, and the end result of that was some pages in the books, because both of them really moved me. So the personal story, and it's all about, none of my work is meant to be scholarly, although let me say this, because it's important for anybody who's interested in looking into any of my work. The first book was a sincere attempt to be objective, insofar as one can, about what I thought Corbin was about. So the first book it certainly reads more scholarly, but it was my attempt to figure out what it was I was reading, because at that point I'd been reading Corbin for several years, and it was all just a huge jumble in my head. I hadn't made it into any kind of structure. And so I sat down to write a little essay about Corbin, and then it turned into a longer essay. And then it turned into a super long essay. And I thought, gosh, I wonder if anybody would publish this. And so Hillman at Spring Publications said, yes, we will totally publish it. I was kind of stunned at the time. Because I wrote it for myself, and I guess that's why it works. Because it was just my attempt to get clear about what Corbin was up to, and people have, to my astonishment, found it useful. I was so scared about putting it out there that I got in touch with Charles Adams. Is that his name? Yeah, who was the head of the Islamic Study Department at McGill. And for some reason, back in the day, you had to send hard copies. So I sent him, the pages, and he was lovely enough to get back to me with really nice comments. And because I said, look, I don't know anything about this stuff, and I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. And he said it was great. So we published it. Every other book since then has been increasingly personal, because it was personal for me from the beginning, as my relationship with Hillman was. Mm-hmm. So during that long period of time when I was learning about Corbin, it's perfectly legitimate to say I was going through a very long and extended spiritual crisis, spiritual, psychological, whatever you want to call it. And Corbin and Hillman held my hand, and Jung too. And then, super importantly, Ivan Illich. Mm-hmm. I read those people, and then they led me elsewhere. And for a long time, I thought, gosh, I might become a Christian, which would have been unthinkable 10 or 15 years before. I thought I could do that. I could. In the end, I can't. No. But we could talk about why. But during that several year period, Illich I just was as what's the right word? Attached, I guess. I was just attached to Illich in a very different way. And to make it clear what was going on intellectually, they're both, as you say, mystical, although Illich I think he would say, no, I'm not. And Corbin is mystical. If Illich is mystical, he's mystical in a very different way, which is what you were saying. But there's I thought, a very great deal in both of their neither one of them has a system, but in both of their orientations, which matches quite closely, they and yet Illich is a very conservative, traditional, incarnationist Catholic who believes profoundly in the reality of the incarnation of God in Christ. It's a central tenet of the whole thing. For Corbin, no, that's the worst mistake that Christianity ever made, was to think that Christ was God.
So because Corbin understands Christ as just a human prophet in line of, say, Muhammad and others. He's not. Yeah. He doesn't have the. Okay.
Yeah, it's a very Islamic view of Christ, with the addition of the idea of the angel. Because Corbin's theology, his Christology is a Christology of the cross of light, mm-hmm. right? And insofar as he would have a favorite book in the New Testament, it would probably be the Gospel of John, though he never says that. But it's a very mystical Christianity, and there's reasons for that, which take a long time to unpack. And yet, Illich and Corbin are very close on a number of other issues. And when you read one, you think, oh, well, that's perfectly consistent with what the other is saying. One of the things that was particularly interesting to me, Corbin is a thoroughgoing critic of institutional religion. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what I take to be a broader critique of any kind of fundamentalism at all, whether it's a scientific fundamentalism, a political fundamentalism. Because Corbin is immersed in the world of the imagination, it is possible for him to see what he would call the iconicity of every being. Every being in reality is a manifestation of something beyond, right? Because of, it's only when you start taking things as literally real that they become idols. So then they become fixed. I have the truth. I always have a rock handy. This rock is just a rock. It's really real. It's just a thing. It's just there. And Corbin would say, no, because then you're going to think that you're able to have final, perfect knowledge of this thing, which is immobile and immobilized. Corbin is always looking for and seeking out the realities hidden behind the appearances. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that's part of his critique of institutional religion. Because if you're going to be if you're going to be the Catholic Church, you got all these people, and you're going to have to tell them stuff. and you're going to have to oh gosh, I got to say something. This is at the heart of Corbin, I think. If you're going to have an institutional religion, you're going to have to say, well, here's what we think. We, the church, or we, Google, or we, Facebook, or we, the United States government, whatever your institution is, you're going to have some rules and some truths and some things that you lay out and laws, right? And Corbin, just kind of shakes his head and says, I know that's true. That's true of society and sociology, but it can't be true of religion, because religion is so fundamentally, deeply, irrevocably personal that you got to have what he calls the exoteric. You got to have the laws, but and you got to obey them, but don't take them as final, complete, and literal, because that's going to lead to violence and oppression. And, because as soon as you've got the truth, you're going to be dangerous, whether you're a scientist or a politician or a prophet or whatever. So Corbin is always really skeptical of any institution. So now you turn over and you look at Illich, and he's got this problem, because he is super conservative and he loves the church. And yet, what does he say? There's a great Latin quote that he uses. the corruption of the best is the worst. And he thinks very clearly, well, he says that the church, the dogmatic institutional church, which he loves, as it developed, brought great evil with it. In this, for him, is this theologically really awkward, but I think necessary way that once you've seen the very best, which for him is exemplified in Christ, you're not that, and you want that, and so you kind of grab it and you fix it. That was so great. Let's make a church because it was so great. Let's make a church, and then now we got to have rules. He says explicitly that the institutionalization of everything in Western society is based upon the institution of the church as a template. Mm-hmm. And as we were talking about before we started recording, so schooling became institutionalized, and he thinks that's awful. and medicine becomes institutionalized, and he thinks that's awful. And politics, and economics, everything becomes institutionalized. And his argument is that the template for those institutions was the church. And so he points in the other direction, and he acknowledges that, well, you need the church. You need the church, sort of the way poetry needs literary criticism. That is to say, Gary Snyder says this, and I'd never thought of this. This is perfect. Gary Snyder says, educational institutions, English departments, literature departments, we got to have those because somebody's got to do the textual stuff. Somebody's got to come up with this is the variorum edition of Shakespeare. But that's all you really need is someone to clean up, because what poetry is not institutionalizable, right? Both Illich and Corbin think that religion is only institutionalizable if you're willing to be really careful about it, So Corbin is kind of a fan of Luther. Luther shows up and says, "Man, look what's happened. These people don't even understand Latin, and you're preaching at them. They don't know what you're saying." He says, "We got to translate the book into German so people can read it, so each individual can read the Bible as if it was written for them." And Corbin says, yes. Insofar as we stick with that, Corbin is very Lutheran. He's very Protestant. In the end, he's a radical, liberal, Protestant, post-Islamic theologian, So what's so fascinating to me is at the time when I was in danger of becoming a Christian, was to try to feel back and forth between these two radically different approaches to Christianity. And what Illich will give you is the heart and, in a way, it's the heart and soul of the kind of Christianity that I think Corbin is suggesting, but minus the angels. so I this is I think super important, because without Illich, I would have misunderstood Christianity, and it's probably true that I would have come to a very different kind of understanding of Corbin, because they are both Christians, but in many respects they're at opposite poles theologically. Where they come together is Illich's idea of conviviality and friendship. For both, how would you even say this? for both, the most central fact of existence is the relationship between two persons.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so Christ, for Illich, Christ has given us an example of what selfless love could be, and so Illich, and as you suggested earlier, Illich, in a super grounded way, says it's friendship. I mean, we could do the whole eros agape thing. We could make it theological, but he says at root, it's what it means to be friends, and that it's that religion, the Christian religion, is so profoundly valuable because it tells you that it's your relationship with another human being, which is the centerpiece of reality. Okay, and Illich, he talks about doing friendship among his group of students. And he says, we have convivial gatherings, and I buy a crate of cheap but good red wine, and we feast together. And when he's in that mode, he doesn't sound theological at all. He's just this really intense guy. Without that take, without that version of Christianity in my heart and mind, I would have probably never, well, who knows what I would have done. I think what it helped me to see, let's put it that way, was the way in which Corbin's Christianity is very similar, but with a lot of angelic bells and whistles. Because for Corbin, what Illich would say was the meeting with Christ. For Corbin, it's the meeting with your angel, because it isn't Christ. It can't be Christ. It's the meeting with your heavenly twin. And so so at that point, their discourse just wanders off in different directions. And so the sense that I always, well, there's even more there in Illich. Illich is astonishingly rich because he was a historian. But we can't do that now. But what was what produced in me a vastly spacious vision of what Christianity, and therefore religion in general, could be, was as a result of playing these two thinkers off against each other there. That's why it would be super interesting to have them in the room together.
Okay. So almost as a foundation there, what it seems that we've got is something which really relates back to your title and also to the title of the book that I mentioned earlier, and also relates back to the quote which you open the book with. So the title, the world turned inside out, which then opens with this quote from Corbin, which is to his sort of philosophical pursuit, it seems, was to turn the world right side out once more, as if everything's become topsy-turvy inside out, and the internal and external have become mixed up in a way which is damaging to both, but is put across in a way which is as if we're doing it correctly, but we're really not. And in this way, the external is put forward as this, as you were on about earlier, this like this external truth which you abide by, and the internal is just subordinate to it. But really, it's that turning it inside out, which also relates back to friendship and an internal considering. So is this almost the foundation here that we're talking about? Is this relationship, philosophical or mystical relationship, between what we're talking about when we talk about the internal and the external lives of someone who is faithful, who is mystical?
Yeah. Yeah. So
There's a lot there. Sorry to say.
Well, see, that's one of the things that makes I could say Henry Corbin, but you could also say this material, whatever this is, infinitely rich. I've been teaching Corbin online now for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, and I taught him a couple times before, but not many. And it's just inexhaustibly complicated and rich, and it really is it being, at least my interpretation of Corbin's cosmology, because it doesn't belong to him. It's a way of seeing. It's a way of seeing the world, attempting to see reality as a whole without attempting to totalize your vision. That is, it's the experience of turning inside out and then trying to look around, which requires as a prelude taking the imagination seriously, but not literally in the reductionist sense. So in my experience, the hurdle that has to be overcome in order to do the turning inside out, or at least to see what it might be like to turn inside out, is the very difficult hurdle of getting rid of all of your literalisms, at least in principle. Whether you can actually do it, that's often a psychological problem. But seeing that in principle, pick your favorite fundament. For my father, it was money. And he was a great guy, but that was reality for him, or if you're, or whatever it is that you take as absolutely fundamental, rock bottom truth, you have to at some point realize, maybe not so much, maybe not so much. And then that can be kind of unsettling. But then you're prepared to make the moves that Corbin calls turning inside out. And what I was trying to say is, once you've realized that reductionism is a mistake as a strategy, and that as Jung beautifully intuited, that what you want instead is what Jung called amplification. And Corbin, he doesn't have a particular word for it, but he does refer to what he calls a Gothic style of cosmology, where things just don't have an end. That the correspondences which apply between everything which is here and that infinity of things which are elsewhere mean that once you've become a poet or a painter or a novelist or an artist, or the right kind of scientist, then you realize that everything changes. You look, and everything is in fact connected, and things are moving, and it's just too exciting and wonderful to be believed. And that why would you try to get a single description that applies? You have to you have to make your breakfast in the morning. And in order to do that, you've got to make some assumptions about things that have to apply pretty well, But which is why you want politicians running your country rather than poets. Nothing will ever get done because people with an imaginational approach to reality, they don't move all that fast all the time because you see too much. So the point I'm trying to make is that we have this really peculiar, and it's not this really peculiar inbred cosmology, and it's probably not only in Western scientific culture, because people screw up in characteristic ways all the time. But we at least, speaking for myself, when I say we, I always mean me, white, male, affluent Westerners, we think our minds are in our head and the world is out there. And the imagination is something that we do somehow, and we make up stuff, which you can do. You can make stuff up. And that the world is kind of solid, there's reality out there. And there's time, and there's space with 3 dimensions, And unless you're a theoretical physicist and they know that time and space aren't like that at all, unless you're a theoretical physicist, you assume these things are just true and stable, and that's the end of it. And here's my rock. You want reality, and Corbin won't have any of that. He won't have any of it, and funnily enough, neither would Heidegger. But that's another story. Heidegger didn't. Corbin says that the Heidegger's problem was that he didn't acknowledge the levels of reality. He made the first step, which was hermeneutics. The first step. There's so much material. Corbin got excited about Heidegger because at the same time that Being in Time was published, and Corbin read it in German, of course, when it first came out, Corbin's also reading Suhrawardi, the 12th century Persian philosopher and mystic. And so he's reading Being in Time while he's reading Suhrawardi, and they're both talking about hermeneutics. And Corbin just says, this is just the best. This is the best. And I have it on good authority that Corbin's glosses in his copy of Being in Time are in Persian and Arabic because he's literally cross-reading Being in Time with Suhrawardi's Mystical Islam. And he's saying, oh, this is so cool. These guys are doing very similar things, except Heidegger says, Sein zum Tod, it's all over when you die. And Corbin says, that's where he goes wrong. He should have said, being beyond death. He cut it short. If he'd read Suhrawardi carefully, he'd have been fine.
Could we say that Heidegger's philosophy is almost like Corbin or Suhrawardi if you were to strip all faith and religious impulse away? Because Heidegger, after his turn away from the priesthood, suddenly becomes extremely almost hostile towards any type of belief. Almost, he turns on a dime, and I always found it very peculiar. But he becomes philosophically it almost disgusts him in a way, which I always found quite strange. So that sort of stripping away quite violently of this thing that she's almost, I always found quite missing in Heidegger. It's almost a lifeless philosophy because of that. Not to say it isn't interesting, but it's dare I say it, emotionless at times. Like real aspects of any heart have been taken out, and you're left with this. I don't know, but it's faithless, is what I'm saying.
Well, this is kind of a footnote, but there's a famous interview with Corbin, which was it with Philip Nemo, when Corbin was quite old, and he's being asked about his the peculiar fact that Corbin was the first French translator of Heidegger, and what, after all, was the connection between Heidegger and Shuravarti and all this. And Corbin answers it all very nicely, but then the questioner says, "Well, what about the later Heidegger?" And Corbin says, I've been busy with other stuff. So I have no idea about after Heidegger's turn, because a lot of people, there's a vast literature on both Heidegger and Corbin. And there's a recent book which probably addresses those issues as to the possible relationship, maybe via Buddhism, with the later Heidegger and Corbin. When Heidegger gets all Greek, he gets all pre-Socratic late. That might be a point of connection between the later Heidegger, about which I know virtually nothing, and Corbin's theology. So as a footnote, back in 1973, when I was reading, The Being and Time and wanted to be a Heideggerian, we weren't told about Heidegger's theological grounding. But for Corbin, it would have been right there, because Corbin knows. Heidegger wrote his dissertation on Duns Scotus, who, for Corbin, it's like, yeah, I know all about that. And the whole tradition of biblical hermeneutics, which in 1973, they didn't tell us about. We just, we're just being Heideggerian. Years later, Corbin is reading Heidegger as a continuator of the hermeneutic tradition of reading holy texts in Western theology. And as you say, Heidegger says, let's take that and steal it from the theologians and make it philosophical, properly philosophical. Corbin never... he didn't care about that. He didn't want, that's the mistake that Heidegger made, to take. So since this is where we are with this, one of the other things that I have found extremely striking as a parallel between Illich and Corbin is the whole idea of correspondences. So one of Corbin's enthusiasms is Emmanuel Swedenborg, about whom I know very little. But if you read Swedenborg, God help you. But Swedenborg gives one a particular take on what correspondences between here and there, the higher realms of being might look like, which Corbin, and then Corbin has Islamic sources for it, is very enthusiastic about. So every being, well, strictly speaking, every being of light, because there's Ahriman. And we could talk about Corbin's implicit and sometimes explicit love for Zoroastrianism, which he maintains right through the end of his life, which is super important for understanding him. He's nothing if not ecumenical. Every being of light has corresponding beings in the various levels that rise up towards the divine, right? And so Swedenborg will say, oh, I was up there with the angels and there were minerals. And of course, Swedenborg was a mining engineer, among other things, before he had his visions. And so it's no surprise to see Swedenborg saying, oh, yeah, man, you should see the rocks up there. They are so great. They are so rock-like, And Corbin has that same theology where things down here are not all that real.
Mm.
But as they get, as your perception, and here's where you need to anchor it in something like Illich, because it's at the level of the immediate that the turning inside out first usually occurs.
Right.
You're looking like at a tree or another human being or the sun, and all of a sudden, you're just gobsmacked, and it becomes more real.
Mm.
And Corbin says, now you're getting it. That as your perception of the world develops over the course of your awakening, things just seem more real. Okay. And what you're sensing is the correspondences between, and saying here and there is really misleading. One of the things that
would lead to a dualism, which would then collapse all those levels, right? So
yeah,
and there is sort of a connection there, even with the hardline Catholicism. I mean, Thomas Aquinas says that the development of man is towards a fullness of being.
Yes. So that's the Illich. Okay, and he's got a quote from St. Thomas that I think I kind of remember. Illich, in one of the interviews that he did with David Cayley, said, we the West, the modern West, we are the only culture that I am aware of, he says, that does not have some sense of correspondences between what's here and what's elsewhere. And he says, St. Thomas says that you cannot think anything unless that thing has correspondences in the worlds of the divine. Mm-hmm. And Illich says, he emphasizes, you cannot think anything unless there, and obviously, as a very sophisticated Thomist, Illich has got a lot of metaphysical, spiritual, mystical, if you want. Corbin would call it thought of the heart, when he says that. One of the things that took me that whole long period to realize is that my vision of Christianity, my vision of medieval Western thought, my vision even of religion was so out of whack, so paltry, so misguided. From Illich, you get the foundational notion that it's love. Mm-hmm. And from Corbin, you get, and what the love opens you up to is an infinity of worlds, just replete with what Thomas calls fullness. The pleroma, Corbin will say. It's just, the world is just stuffed full of magical things. There's a quote that I just ran across because I've gotten interested in music lately more than I had been in a long time. There's a magnificent quote from John Coltrane, and I can't actually quote it, but he says, well, what music is to me is telling people all about the marvelous things that you sense and see in the world. That's what music is to me. And I thought, oh man, that's what Corbin's about. Mm-hmm. But in order to do that, he says right in that first page of his book on Ibn Arabi, we in the West have for a long time given the imagination to the poets and the artists, and then not taken them seriously at all because they're only imagining things. And he says, we, the philosophers and mystics and theologians, have to acknowledge the fact that, no, we're soaking in imagination all the time. And so the process of turning inside out is the process which is the dynamic which can occur when you let your awareness escape from the little prison that we put it in. And I got one more thing, which is in the first book. It was another connection that really helped me understand Corbin. People will know of David Abram's first book, The Spell of the Sensuous, which was published in the 90s. So it came out about the same time I was reading Corbin for the first time. And I actually was teaching biology at the time, and he's an ecological philosopher. And so we read the book back in the 90s at the college I was teaching at. And, well, two things. So Abram uses the term turning inside out. I think it's the title of his final chapter in that magnificent book, which is still really one of my favorites. Mm-hmm. And he tells this fantastic story, which, as I remember it, is about like this. Well, so I'm reading Corbin, and Abram says, boy, I spent several years in Southeast Asia or wherever he was, living among indigenous peoples, and really getting inside their worldview, so that he felt really changed. He really, really felt that he had gone over to the other side. And then it was time to go back to Stony Brook, where he was doing his dissertation, and he landed at JFK, and, it nearly killed him. It's like, oh no. So it was very difficult for him. And he said, so in order to keep my sanity, I had to develop some practices to try to ground myself in that wonderful sensibility that I'd spent those years developing. And in his description of how you move outside yourself and into the world, it's a perfect mirror of Corbin's description of exactly the same thing. At least that's the way I read it at the time, 1993, 94, whenever it was. And that, like Illich, helped me see that Corbin, in spite of or because of all the angelic hierarchies and the difficult scholarly language, he's talking about love in the personal sense that Illich means it. And he's talking about the reawakening of your senses to the world around you. That's the whole theme of David Abram's wonderful book of ecological philosophy. And those two things for me were like, okay, this guy Corbin, however he got it, here it is, and I'll stick with him.
Well, we've touched on a lot. I think I don't mean this in a bad way. I don't think I've done an interview where I've only got through one question before out of the list, list that I had.
Yeah. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, we the thing is, we've dived into about 5 different roots of philosophy, which are so unfathomably rich. Because it doesn't help that Corbin himself is touching on an unfathomable amount of reference material and resources, right? Okay. So how would if someone has perhaps done a basic course in philosophy, how would you advise them to begin studying Corbin? Where could you go wrong? How could you misrepresent him or misunderstand him?
Okay, so let's see what would be a good preparation. There's no way in hell you can prepare philosophically or theologically adequately because I mean, it's just impossible. No matter what you know, he will throw things at you that you've never heard of, that he assumes you know all about. Because and I will try to keep my answer kind of crammed down, but that's because of the context in which most of the text we have by him was produced. It was at the Aranos conferences. And there was a pretty select group of people who were the most accomplished scholars in their fields. And yes, Corbin is super academic and super scholarly. And so and this is part of the thing you have to acknowledge going in, he's going to do that to you. If you have a basic grounding in the issues of Western philosophy, even just there's no way you're going to know enough. I didn't, I mean, I'm speaking from personal experience. So I'm reading Corbin, and you don't know who this is, you don't know who that is. Here's what I tell people. I first of all, there's two books, either of which you could probably start with. One is The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism, but I would suggest rather starting with his book on Ibn Arabi. And no matter what your background is, there's going to be stuff in there that is unfamiliar to you, and you should skip it. My approach to that book in particular is, and this has worked with undergraduates, smart, lively, and by smart, what do I mean? Sensitive. I think if you have a background in any of the imaginative arts and their criticism, it depends on who you studied. If you're a poet or a painter or a dancer, and you're used to using your mind and body in creative ways, and you try to keep that in mind, that may help you to penetrate through his scholarly erudition to get to the heart of what he's talking about. And I picked the book on Ibn Arabi because it's full of stories and anecdotes. And what I used to tell people under juniors and seniors, I haven't taught to a lot of them, but I did back in the day to a few. Just skip the parts that don't make any sense to you and read the other stuff. Because when he's good, or at least when he's writing well, he suggests things to you. And he's writing out of the tradition of the Bible and theology, and he takes angels very seriously, but not literally. In fact, and I mean, so as an example of the kind of preparation that would really help, in one of his later works, he says, this business about the angels can really throw people. And he says, but if you want to understand what I mean by angels and what Islam means by angels, and this may in fact not be true, but Corbin thinks it is, you should read Rilke. You should read Rilke's elegies, because the angels that appear in Rilke's elegies are précisément what I mean. They are exactly the angels that I mean. And those are very terrifying angels in Rilke's elegies. If you like William Blake, if you know some Coleridge or some, any of that will help. It'll either grab you or won't. But there are books and essays that you shouldn't start with. I don't think there's anything in the volume Temple and Contemplation that I would ever start with. And one of the most obscure things he ever wrote is also one of the most important. It's that essay on cyclical time in Ismaili Gnosis, which is just mind-bendingly obscure and weird. And, and so preparation is being willing to read it as if it were poetry. Yeah.
Okay. Well, would you like to come on again and discuss Corbin again? Because there was so much we didn't touch on.
Sure.
And I think I'd like to maybe graft two together because
I would absolutely. Yeah, sure. I like doing it, and I think I think what Corbin was doing is super important. I mean, and it doesn't have to be gotten through Corbin. Mm-hmm. It can be gotten many, many ways. One of you can edit this out if you want, but one of the things we could do it in the next essay at the time we talk. One of the things which I didn't realize until I had been doing Corbin for a long, long time. One day I thought to myself, gosh, I wonder if anybody outside of the Aranos lectures and Hillman, does anybody else pay attention to Corbin, outside of Islamic studies? Bingo! Poets, and particularly in the United States, though there were some Brits. Eric Mottram is an example of one of the Brits who was really enthusiastic. Turns out there's all sorts of poets in the United States who were reading the Bollingen volumes as they came out from the Princeton University Press. They were publishing Aranos lectures. And when Corbin stuff started to come out, Charles Olson, Robert Duncan, who then had tremendous influence, all sorts of people were reading Corbin and saying, oh, this is what I do. I'm a poet. I'm a poet who takes language and the imagination this seriously. Mm-hmm. And I love this guy. So there's all sorts of ways into this.
Okay. Maybe I'll have to reformulate my questions because
I will talk through whatever you ask me. You have to be prepared, and you also have to be prepared to tell me to shut up. I'm
prepared for that. I wasn't prepared for how much, but I will admit I wasn't prepared for. Sometimes when you deal with these forgotten thinkers or underappreciated thinkers, there's one of the reasons that the Academy. And I don't think this is an agenda. I think it's fashion or ease. But one of the reasons academies sometimes don't want to perhaps deal with thinkers in a curriculum is for the reason that this first conversation has perhaps been this sort of explosion, is because, well, you can't say, right, here's step 1, step 2, step 3, because as soon as you do step 1, it's like, well, now you need to go and know that and this and this. So with Corbin, right, it's like, well, you need to know Islamic mysticism, you need to know Ibn Arabi, but you also, there's this the problem of mysticism in the West with the relation to Heidegger going on. So you all of a sudden, to know one thing, you need to know 10 others. Yeah. And it's not like Immanuel Kant, where you go, right, read the Critique of Pure Reason, just understand that, right? You don't need to go outside of Kant to understand Kant in a way, but that's inherent to Corbin.
That's a seriously great comment, and I'd only add as further explication is that neither Corbin, Illich, Corbin, Hillman, none of them are systematic thinkers. They just are where they are. And where they are is where most people aren't. And so everything looks weird from where they are. And if you just say, oh, look over here, it's not going to cut it. So you have to spend a long time in their little worlds, in their universes, their huge worlds, in order to get your bearings.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay. Well, finish this conversation here, and we'll enter that universe again, and then I'll release these as 2 parts, or maybe even 3. We'll see.
Sure. I'm perfectly happy to do that. Yeah.
Okay.